Welcome back, everyone, to our new episode of Community Connection of the Lehigh Valley. I am Victoria Olursha, licensed professional counselor in the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania. We are missing our co-host today, who is Mark Kenny from Chestnut Hill College. So we will welcome him back for our next episode. But we are excited. It's been a while since we've recorded an episode. And today's guest, Gwen Olton from MKGandhi Institute, is joining us. Welcome, Gwen.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
We are excited to have you here. Today, we are going to be talking about her book, From Conflict to Community, and just all the wonderful educational, informational nuggets in here that we're going to talk about. So we're just going to dive right in so we can get as much information as we can in the segment today. So Gwen, if you can just start off by just introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about your role and the institute.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So I'm Gwen Olton or Gwendolyn on my book cover. I really use both names, but I guess I do mostly introduce myself with Gwen. And I'm a co-director at the MKGandhi Institute for Nonviolence, which is in Rochester, New York. And I think that's it.
That's a short version. Yeah, that's great. So we're gonna dive right into your book. And let's just start off by, can you inform us a little bit about just conflict in general?
Sure. Yeah. It's such a big topic, right? So I really wanted to write this book because I've been I've been kind of a helper to conflicts for a lot of my life, but then before I was at the Gandhi Institute, just kind of as an aside, I would do mediations and restorative justice circles and other kind of conflict processes. I don't want to, it's not as a side hustle, but as a passion project. I really wasn't doing things for pay or to be part of capitalist structures. It was just, I just was really passionate about conflict work. And I noticed that, a lot of people have a lot of skills for helping friends and close ones in conflict, but just could use like some extra guidance or some extra tips maybe. So I really wanted to write a book for people who are not interested in becoming professional conflict resolvers or transformers, but want to kind of skill up and also want to support others when people in their circles have conflicts.
That's nicely said. I mean, I think this topic is so needed right now, in individually, in our families, our homes, in our community, so I'm really excited to hear what you need to share. So can you tell us about what are some of the areas in our life? I mean, I kind of listed them off, but like what are some of the areas that we would notice conflict coming up for us?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess this goes back to your first question when you asked me about conflict and I talked about the book, but still like thinking it kind of depends on how we define conflict in some ways. And so in the book and in my work, generally, I tend to define conflict as just like any misalignment that we have. Could be inner conflict, but I'm just going to talk about for ease conflict between people, individuals. So any misalignment we have that's like causing tension in some ways, that's causing some sort of discomfort. And so that could be something as small as like, you are living with housemates and you have this feeling that you're always the one doing the dishes and other people aren't doing the dishes. And maybe you're not actively fighting about it, but there's misalignment around what the agreements are for doing dishes and there's tension, right? So we could have conflicts at home, we could have them at school, at work, with neighbors. I mean, everywhere, conflicts everywhere.
Sure. I love that word misalignment. I feel like it's a gentle way perhaps of saying conflict. We're just not aligning with each other right now. I love that word. So can you give us maybe a few other examples of, you gave the example of like a roommate, but what about like a school setting or a community setting? What other ways would we see conflict coming up?
Yeah. So like in a school setting, I mean, we might have conflicts between, well, if we're talking about kind of like K through 12 or something, right? We might have conflicts between students. We might have conflicts student to teacher to teacher conflicts. might have family conflicts with the school. I'm thinking about, yeah, I've definitely seen conflicts in the past with parents who are working hard to get services for their students and feel like they're in conflict with the school. And it can seem like from their perspective, the school doesn't want to give their child services, right? So that's a conflict that I've seen a lot in community. If we're thinking about groups that are organizing for some kind of change, there can be conflict like within the group, but there can also be conflict, with the group between bodies of government in the city. I'm thinking about like the fight for housing in my city, for instance. And it might be that while some of the tenant organizing groups are really aligned in general with maybe the party that's in office, they might have conflict with the way that some of the policies are happening or not happening, right? So you can have conflict on the individual level, but then there's kind of within group and group to group. Yeah. Is that
Absolutely.
helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a word that comes to mind with conflict is justice, right? So then depending on whatever scenario we're in, I think that's a lot of us will feel like we want justice in however the conflict plays out, right? And sometimes it doesn't feel like everyone involved receives, I guess, the justice that they're looking for. Can you maybe educate us a little bit more on just what justice is and how we can obtain that?
Yeah, that's such a good question and really challenging to answer, both because the topic of justice is really huge, and because I think it is often the case that we're feeling like we don't have a sort of sense of fairness or justice
Mhm.
in our conflicts, especially when we're looking at sort of societal and organizational and structural levels. Maybe
Mhm.
we feel like sometimes we can get it on the individual level. So in the book, I talk about how our understanding of justice sort of informs what we
Mhm.
are looking for out of conflict.
Mhm.
And so a lot of us grow up with a sense of justice as being kind of a form of punishment. It's people
Mhm.
getting what they deserve.
Mhm.
Um, these phrases kind of come up, and you might hear like eye for an eye, or yeah, when people will talk about fairness, they're often talking about this sense of people getting what they deserve, and the
Mhm.
getting what you deserve is often kind of a code for getting punished because you have done something that is wrong or broke a law or that somebody didn't like. Um, and I think we grow up with the many of us in the US, not everybody, not every culture, not every family of origin might grow up with some of these concepts, and it becomes so like we're just so used to it, thinking about justice this way, that it can be really hard for us to imagine another way of doing things. So this kind of painting in broad strokes, but this kind of model is sort of a retributive or punitive justice. So looking at fairness as being obtained when sort of scales are balanced or corrected, and
Mhm.
that happens through the punishment or the consequences being doled out to someone who has done something harmful to someone else. So there's alternative sorts of, and it's alternative to this model. I always want to kind of put in air or scare quotes alternative here, because for many parts of the world and for many, I think, generations all over the world, this wasn't the alternative. It was sort of the norm, where these other notions of justice around what we will call now restorative and transformative justice. And there are distinctions between those that I won't get super into, but they're ways of understanding fairness as happening when harms are corrected and relationships are repaired, and the underlying causes and conditions that caused the harm to happen to begin with are fixed in some
Mhm.
way. So,
Mhm.
yeah, is hoping that's clear.
Yeah, no, that's great. Honestly, it just takes me right down the path of therapy, so like identifying the root causes. I mean, that's what I'm hearing you say, right? Because if
Yeah.
we have individuals that come into therapy and they're exhibiting certain behaviors, I mean, we're going to dig deep to understand why those behaviors are coming out. And I think that's aligned with exactly what you're saying. There's parts of your book where you talk about encouraging that understanding, that listening, empathy, reflection, trying to be mindful of not judging in these type of situations, which when we are, I'm going to use the word passion, when we are passionate about again, justice, if we want to go back to that word, I think sometimes it makes it a little bit more difficult to be able to keep that lens of like empathy on for all parties involved in a situation. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that, of ways that we can start problem solving, through a conflict, with keeping, justice in mind and some of these other skills and factors?
Yeah. It's a great question. And it's also, again, like super, super challenging. And I want to say, in order to kind of have and hold empathy and compassion for people who are doing things that are really harmful or unjust, it's an incredible stretch. And it's not always something that we want to engage with. And I really want to honor that, like, there's all kinds of reasons that we might not want to engage with that empathic stretch. And that, like, one version of what this is called like bridging. In some ways, it's like making connections with someone who maybe has like values opposition to you or to something with you. And I think in order to do that, you need to really be able to feel safe. And there are many conflicts where I'm talking with people who don't actually feel safe with the other person.
Sure.
And so in those instances, I might, I don't want to ask anyone to do that kind of imaginative empathic stretch to empathize with someone who is dehumanizing them or causing a lot of harm. And it's not that I don't think that that person is deserving in some way of empathy. I want that person to have empathy and experience compassion, because ultimately I think the reasons we dehumanize and cause harm are because of all kinds of reasons involving not having enough compassion in the world, right?
Sure.
And I know, like, an individual who might be experiencing harm, like, they might not be the one to be doing that work. So
Sure,
I just want to kind of like put some of those caveats out there. And but if we're talking about just kind of like maybe smaller scale, like lower level conflict, meaning like, it's not like 10 out of 10 in intensity of like harm happening or something, but just like the kinds where you're going to stay in relationship, maybe no one's dehumanizing the other, but you're still having trouble empathizing with the person because, you feel like they're being a jerk, or you're just like really sure that you're right. So some strategies for that, I think, are getting some empathy for like your side or your part of the story first, not from that person that you're in conflict with, but from someone else. So talking to a friend, talking to a loved one, asking for them to just like understand and like reflect back what they're hearing, so that you can really feel heard and understood. And then you'll have more emotional resources available to go talk with the other person, and you're more likely to be able to empathize with their perspective after you've gotten some empathy yourself.
What are your thoughts? And I might be digressing a little bit from the questions we already identified that we're going to discuss today, but something that's coming up to me is, at what point do we choose to try to resolve a conflict just one-on-one, as opposed to when do we recognize that it's necessary to maybe bring like a third party in or a mediator?
Yeah, it's a good question. On the one hand, when I'm working as a third party to other people's conflicts, I'm often wishing they had like called me in sooner,
Sure.
or that they had called for help sooner, because sometimes, I find that folks aren't asking for help or getting support until the conflict is so deeply entrenched that it's like, I'm like, oh, I don't know. I think it's going to take more than one session. There's a lot to unpack. We've been hurting each other back and forth for years, so I want to encourage people to get more support for their conflict. And I don't think, like, for sure, not everyone has access to mediators or third parties as trained kind of like professionals or people with certificates. And that's also part of why I wrote this book, because I actually really don't think you need trained professionals or trained third parties for a huge majority of conflicts that we experience. And if we could just if we had trusted people in our lives, if we knew, actually, my cousin, Kai is super skilled at conflict, and a bunch of people call on them, and it's like totally totally fine and they don't have a degree or certificate, but they're really good at helping people with conflict,
Mhm.
right? Like there are
Yeah.
people like that in our lives.
Mhm.
And I'm really wanting to boost those those networks and those
Mhm.
folks' confidence to
Mhm.
just do that. Because I think you probably could name a few people at least that you can talk to when you have a conflict that
Sure.
support you in it, even if they
Right.
don't sit down with you for the conversation.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
I guess when you need like someone to sit with you and accompany you together for
Mhm.
a conversation as a third party, that's like if you are, you're using you've used all your skills and all your resources to try to have conversation with a person.
Mhm.
And it just maybe every time you're doing it, it's kind of um yeah, just devolving into something really unproductive and maybe harmful. If that's kind of happening over and over again and you can't quite get out of the cycle, then I would
Sure.
ask someone to sit with you. Yeah.
So now I have a follow-up question. So what skills or qualities would we be looking for in an individual where we could say that might be a good person to be a mediator?
Mm. Well, definitely, like if you are looking for, mediation that's like official, there
Mhm.
are
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
definitely like
Sure.
tons of like resources and sites to look
Sure.
for. And
Right.
I in no way want to minimize like that profession or that work. I
Of
want people to
course.
be paid for their work.
Right.
And if you are, what I generally say is like if you have if you kind of do a mental scan of like who in my friend and family and community group do I have
Mhm.
that when I talk with them about conflict, I feel like they are supportive and make the
Mhm.
conflict better rather than make it
Mhm.
worse. I mean, it's
Mhm.
really like a who I think I use this sort of metaphor in the book because I use it all the time. It's like when you think about like your conflict or your anger about something as like a fire, who pours
Mhm.
gasoline on the fire and who
Mhm.
pours water on the fire. And look, like
Mhm.
not all anger fires need to be put out, right? Like I want us to be angry about injustice. I want us to be angry about changes that need to happen, but
Mhm.
um we kind of know when that sort of anger is a productive anger or whether it's like an anger that's causing us to dehumanize someone and to
Mhm.
demonize someone and just turn them into our enemy. And so calling on the people that you know in your life who have these skills, who are supportive in some way. And generally what I would I think everybody kind of does this and shows up differently, but some of the skills I might look for is someone who can reflect and show understanding, someone who I can tell care, even if I'm coming to them really angry. Like for instance, if I was coming to you and I was really angry at my partner, I would want I would want it to be clear that you are still holding care for my partner, even while you're
Mhm.
supporting me. I wouldn't want someone
Yes.
who's saying a bunch of mean or terrible things about my partner just to like be on my
Mhm.
bandwagon with the anger.
Mhm. Sure.
And I might look for I personally would look for someone who only gives me advice if I ask for it.
Mhm.
And only if it's like they are clear that they have something to share.
Mhm.
So those are some of my criteria
That's
for
great.
what I would look for, but I think we
Yeah.
each kind of have our own.
Sure. No, I mean, I love so many things. I love the concept of like doing this mental scan. I mean, because whether we're in conflict or not, it's really important that we are aware of who's in our circle and who's in our environment. And I have that conversation with my clients a lot about, being aware of how your body is responding mentally, emotionally, physically when you're in certain environments around certain people, because that's going to have an effect on us more than we might even realize. So I love that mental
Mm.
scan and absolutely like that care for the other person involved, some care or understanding from all individuals involved that will hopefully, lessen the fuel if we all feel like we're heard to some degree by the mediator who's trying to help us out. I think those are great points. And so going back to kind of like those, what I was describing, like these stress responses, like how would we notice within ourselves? Because we want to be in a fairly, I guess, healthy place when we go in to address a conflict, right? If all parties are fueled, that's probably going to decrease the chances that we're going to come to some sort of compromise. So what would be some of those stress responses that we would notice within ourselves to kind of, be mindful of?
Yeah. again, I think these can really vary, by the person. And I think the first thing I would suggest is to start to pay attention when you're feeling kind of upset about something, and see if you can like pause and notice like what are the sensations in my body that I'm experiencing with this kind of activation that's happening. Because usually it started before our conscious thinking has like really gotten going with it.
Mm-hmm.
And you could do like a little sort of thought experiment to elicit a little bit of this response in yourself to see how it happens. You can just think for a minute and see if you can think about a conflict that you've had recently that made you pretty upset, and like really, get into it and imagine it. Put yourself back in that situation, transport yourself in your imagination there, and then try to notice what's happening in your body. I love a thought experiment with conflict work, because it's really safe, right? And we can kind of titrate, like, okay, I'm not going to pick like my worst conflict ever. I'll just
Sure.
pick kind of a small one, and we're maybe by ourselves, maybe with a buddy, but just thinking
Mm-hmm.
about like, okay, like this is what's going on for me. But some of the typical signs are just sort of normal sympathetic activation. Like for most of us, we have some kind of sympathetic activation when we're in conflict. And so we might have a faster heart rate, our breathing might change, might become a little bit more shallow feeling. Our pupils might dilate, our muscles might feel tense. We might feel like we're holding energy or tension up in our like neck, or maybe sometimes our big muscle groups. We might get a stomach ache, we might have a headache.
Sure.
Um, yeah.
And probably even being aware of noticing those signs perhaps in the other person as well, because you might feel like you're in a good place to revisit the conflict with the individual that you want to address it with, and so being aware of that as well, because it's okay to say, if this is not the right time for either one of us, can we take a pause? And then come back to it. Or again, if you're doing without a mediator, do we need to find a mediator at this point moving forward with it. And so, are there grounding techniques or something? So, like once we identify these stress responses in ourselves, what would be some grounding techniques or some skills that we can use to get ourselves like individually into a healthier place before we go into having this potential, resolution of a conflict?
Yeah. It's boring, but it's, I mean, breathing is like the, is probably the
We
best
all need to
one.
breathe.
Yeah. Just, bringing some conscious attention to the breath. And also I want to say like, most people will not get through a conflict without sympathetic activation. And so some of it is like,
Mhm.
how am I going to cope with the fact that my nervous system is activated the whole time I'm having this
Mhm.
conversation? We just don't want to be up here. We want to be like here, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, I recently yeah, had a tough conversation. Someone was upset with me for something. They were really, really mad. And I was like, "Ooh, yeah, my heart is pounding." And also it's like, I want to get through this.
Mhm.
It's unlikely that I will have conflict without some sympathetic activation, right? So
Mhm.
just to set that stage, to lower the expectation that we're like completely settled, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, breathing, trying to breathe slowly, breathing through the nose can help for some people if you do a breathing practice before you go in to a tough conversation. And then I'm a big supporter of support. So
Yeah.
like text a buddy, phone a friend before you're going to have the tough conversation, and then make a plan to talk with them afterwards,
Mhm.
so that no matter what happened, you have a little bit of
Mhm.
emotional support from someone who kind of knows what the deal is.
Yeah, I love that suggestion of like the before and after planning because I mean I can get really stuck in my head sometimes, and I mean I think most of us need like that sounding board of like, can I just run this past you, like before I go into this meeting or before I, work with this individual, and then definitely like that almost debriefing, I guess, afterwards, because then sometimes depending on how that conflict or that conversation goes, we can kind of stay stuck in our head kind of replaying things for a while. So I love that suggestion of like the before and after planning. I think that's great. Another thing that you share in your book is just, and correct me if I'm not viewing this from the right perspective, but just conflict can be used as a teacher, as informational, right? It's not always, I think that word conflict has such a negative connotation behind it, but in any scenario, there's an opportunity to learn something. So can you maybe tell us a little bit more about how we can shift our perspective to look at it from a healthier dynamic?
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, there are very few conflicts I've had in my life. I'm not even sure right in this moment if I can come up with an example, but kind of like that phrase, like you never, I don't know if you've heard this before, but like you never regret a workout or like a run or
Mm,
something, right?
mm-hmm,
This is kind of how I feel about getting through conflict. Like I never really regret getting through a conflict, or
yeah.
having a conflict if I've actually worked through it. They're
Mm-hmm.
tough, but when you get through them, you're like better on the other side, and relationships are stronger on the other side. And so conflict is information is, I have to credit some of my teachers, Nikki Cashton specifically for this one. She's talking about conflict from a systemic level, if we're working in a group or an organization or under multiple systems, that conflict shows up because other systems aren't working well. And
Mm,
there's other people and theorists who talk about this too, but that's just where I learned it from. And I think about, if I've got a conflict with someone in the organization where I work, there's content to that conflict that is giving us information about something that we haven't set up well. So,
mm-hmm,
um, yeah, I like right now we are as a team working out some misalignments around when we want to start things together on Wednesdays. We work together on Wednesdays, and people
mm-hmm,
have really different sleep schedules. They have
mm-hmm,
different circadian rhythms. And
mm-hmm,
I thought we had agreed that we were going to start at 9:30, but then it looks like it's not working for everyone, right?
mm-hmm,
So we could approach this as like classic conflict where we're like mad and one person tries to exert authority and say like
mm-hmm,
we said 9:30, we're doing 9:30, that's
mm-hmm,
it. Or
mm-hmm,
we could approach it as like, oh, what is this misalignment trying to teach us
mm-hmm,
about what isn't working? So
mm-hmm.
we're a small team, we can work it out and figure out something else to do. So it might be information like, oh, we're not actually finding the thing that we're doing at 9:30 very meaningful, and so we're just coming in like a little bit later. Or, oh, actually, like a lot of times I'm really tired on Wednesday, so like 9:30 isn't working for me and something else would work better, right? Like there's
Sure.
information there that we can learn about each other.
Sure. Is there like specific, I guess, wording maybe or a certain approach that you would encourage someone to use when they want to address I love again this misalignment. I really love that word. If we want to go about addressing this misalignment with someone, whether it's a partner or a colleague or whoever, yeah, like is there some framework that you would encourage us to approach it with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do tend to use misalignment a lot, but there are other words I really like. My predecessor, and a mentor of mine, Kit Miller, she often uses the word dilemma.
Mm,
So she'll say like, I have a dilemma, like, this thing is happening and I notice this thing is happening, or whatever it
mhm,
is. Many people are afraid of the word conflict. And
mm,
if we say like, I'm having a conflict with you, it
mhm.
sounds like very
You're
scary to
already
people,
fired
right?
up. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And like maybe those of us who work in conflict aren't as fired up by it. But even I like, working with folks who deal with conflict all the time, I'm unlikely to use that word when I'm talking with them unless something has been going on for a long time. So yeah, I think
Mhm.
misalignment, dilemma, struggle. I think using words with I statements can be helpful.
Mhm.
I'm needing clarity. I'm not understanding
Mhm.
something. I'm feeling conflicted, right? Like
Mhm.
that might be one.
Mhm.
Um, but personalizing it to you and your experience, I think can take some of the heat out of it because then we're not coming in with blame, which puts people onto the
Yeah.
defense.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Um, any other thoughts or any other points from your book that you would want to share with our community?
Hmm. I think just to like trust yourself and your intuition with
Mhm.
conflicts. Notice how you're showing up for people when
Mhm.
they're having a conflict, and see how you can support things in a way that makes things better and makes
Mhm.
people able to and supports people staying in community together rather than
Mhm.
kicking each other out or fighting or escalating things.
Sure, sure. No, I love that. So if any of our listeners would want to purchase your book, can you tell them where they can find it at?
Sure. you can find the best place for the author and publishing generally is to buy it from the publisher. So you could get it at a local, I would say a local bookstore, or bookshop.org, which will support indie bookstores. And my publisher is Microcosm.
Okay.
And so if you go to Microcosm's website and search for the book, it'll be there. And I can send you a link too.
Okay, wonderful. And then I guess my final question is just, would you like to share your contact information, or if someone wants to reach out to you or reach out to the MKGandhi Institute to just kind of learn more about the services that you offer the community, or you directly about your book, like what would the contact information be for our listeners?
Yeah, people can feel free to email me. My email is gwen@gandhiinstitute.org. So that's GWEN at GandhiInstitute.org.
You got it. Yeah.
And our website is gandhiinstitute.org.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gwen. I really appreciated you making this time to just share about your book and some really helpful tips for our community. Thank you so much for our listeners. Be well, reach out if you need any support, and take care. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.